I saw your name.
Okay. I didn't look at him. I just got on. I didn't, I hadn't seen the link. I guess the link just came through. But I think the invitation was there, so I should have seen it.
We are live. And it is 6:02. So, is Professor Lopez Oro is not here yet. We'll give it another minute.
How long is it?
An hour.
Okay.
Yes, and I will certainly set a hard cutoff for 7 p.m.
Oh, then I have to go back and be mother to the 4-year-old.
Stick around. I have all night.
That's Liliana. That's Liliana. Is the correct pronunciation of your name?
Yes.
Liliana. Okay.
Just gonna find out what's going on with. It is 6:04. I think we can get started and let Professor Lopez Oro come on. Maybe there was some last minute change of plans, but I'm going to stop sharing and Julia can kick us off.
All right, cool. Thank you. First, I just want to thank all the panelists for taking the time to participate in this conversation with us. We are so grateful. Secondly, welcome everyone to Wake Up Wellesley's third live stream discussion. My name is Julia jordahl-henry, and I'm taking the place of Kayla Reed today. I was a panelist in the past 2 discussions, but today I will be hosting because Kayla ran into a conflict. So both of those discussions were recorded and can be found on this YouTube channel. After this, don't forget to check them out. So yeah, a little bit about me is I've lived in Wellesley my entire life, and I'm a white passing.
How long is that?
Oh, I'm 19.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, 19 years.
Entire life, okay.
Yes. And I am a white passing biracial person of color with a twin sister that presents more stereotypically biracial. So essentially, most people perceive her as Black and me as white. Growing up, that made me hyper aware of just how much I benefited from my whiteness in Wellesley Public Schools. The differences I've witnessed between me and my sister's experiences underline just how necessary systematic changes needed in our community as a whole. So it is our hope that through these discussions, we can identify the changes to prioritize in designing anti-racist institutions and policy with the ultimate objective of creating a more inclusive Wellesley that attracts residents, students, educators, and leaders of color. So our distinguished guests are leaders in our national fight for equity, professors and academics representing such esteemed institutions such as Wellesley College, Smith College, Boston University, and Northwestern University. So before we begin, we ask that each of our speakers briefly introduce themselves, their affiliations, their research interests, and the focus of their work.
Who should start?
You should start.
Okay. I'm Brenna Greer, and I'm an associate professor of history at Wellesley College, and my research is generally combined civil rights, history, and Black capitalism, but also visual culture and consumerism. I'm gonna veer out of the academic realm for a moment to say that I'm really interested actually in this aspect of biracial white passing, because that is the other 2/3 of my family. My husband is biracial white passing. My 4-year-old, she doesn't know what she is, but she is biracial white passing, and that has made living in Wellesley, teaching at Wellesley, an interesting experience in, you know, all manner of ways. And I also should say that I am actually no longer a resident of Wellesley. I just in December moved into Natick for reasons that are actually very related to the issues that we'll discuss here today. So I really appreciate being a part of this conversation on many levels, as an educator, as a parent, as a resident, as a person. So thank you for the invitation.
I can pass it on to Professor Cudjoe.
Okay, I'm Selwyn Kajo. I'm a professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. I have lived in Wells for the past 34 years, so I've seen some of the changes. And I do work mostly in literary theory and, say, Caribbean history and African American history. Is it? I hope I could be helpful.
It's an honor to have you. Professor Hawkins Owen.
Hear me okay?
Professor whom?
That's me, Iana Hawkins Owen. My pronouns are she, her, he, him, and I'm an assistant professor at Boston University. My research is on African diaspora theory and also asexuality or lack of desire. But some of the classes that I teach are about prison, about direct action, which is why I think I was included today. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, and thank you so much to the organizers for having all of us here.
Thank you. Bria Gambrell.
My name is Bria Gambrell. I'm a DEI consultant, mainly working with legal aid organizations in the state of Massachusetts, but also small corporate and private law firms. I'm a community organizer, and I have a master's in public policy and an MA in gender and cultural studies. And my areas of focus, other than obviously diversity, equity, and inclusion, are race and surveillance and the intersections and where that brings us policy-wise. So I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and want to figure out what we can help Wellesley with.
Thank you. Ashley Dennis.
Thanks so much for having me. I am Ashley Dennis. I'm a PhD candidate in African American Studies at Northwestern. And my research interests include 20th century African American history, Black women's history, and education.
All right, thank you so much to all of you. And again, we are honored to host you. If you have, this is to the audience, but if you have any comments or questions, you can use the chat where our co-organizers will be responding to the best of their ability. So I'm going to pass it off to Liliana now, because she'll be moderating this.
Okay.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you again to all of our guests. So I wanted to begin because we have so much of academia represented among our panelists. I wanted to start by talking about one of Professor Iana Hawkins Owen's courses on the prison system. And it's a fascinating course. You should read the syllabus if you have the opportunity. But this course, in this course, the assignments, like papers, were delivered in the form of personal letters, like personal letter writing assignments. And in a review of this course, one student found that the course challenged her because it asked her to do something we are rarely asked to do in university courses: merge the personal and the political. However, it is often argued that in studying history or politics, the content should be studied and discussed through an objective lens. In other words, leaving the personal and one's emotional biases out of the discourse. When designing curricula and studying literature and history with a particular focus on issues of injustice, what do you believe to be the value of merging the personal and the political?
Thanks for mentioning that class. Yeah, a little bit of context is initially I had conceived of the class as possibly being in the style of having students write to people who are incarcerated. But instead I thought more about the setting of the course, which is at a rural elite institution, and trying to think about who has access to the class and who doesn't, and then also who you're more likely to allow yourself to be transformed by. So the letters were written by the students to their family members or their friends or any person in their life that they considered themselves to have love for. And so the reason for doing that was I was imagining at the end of this class, I was hoping it would contribute to some broader thinking and organizing around abolition, but that would only be possible if students had practice translating the material that they were encountering to their own lives, and then also to the lives and concerns of people that they knew. And so I think that what that student was trying to get at is that theoretically, we talk a lot intersectionally about the personal as political and inheriting that from feminist movements, but actually doing the work of your required assignments for the class, asking you to find your personal investment in this material, understand how you can allow it to undo your own life. And then after that, think about how telling people just to Google the answers to things, which you've probably heard a lot over the years, but especially recently, I think doesn't work because, plenty of people Google things all the time, and then they wind up at Breitbart or 4chan just as easily as they wind up on Tumblr reading about Judith Butler or something. And so what I think does work though is acts of translation. And so asking students to, in the classroom, translate the work they're reading to explain why did their cousin end up in prison? Was that story already foretold before they were born? And, or why no one they know has ever had a family member in prison, and like having to wrestle with the facts of their life they've taken for granted so far. And then the other half of my answer to your question is, when I think about the most transformative political moments in my own life, they've always been instigated by someone who cared about me. So I thought, how if I have to teach a class, how can I make love and commitment a central component of that at the same time that I'm assigning grades to people?
I want to jump in and say that I think that the question of, whether to merge the personal and the political says a lot about kind of the politics of education, particularly right now. To me, as a historian, it's almost an absurd, to the point of offensive, how do you not merge the personal and the political, particularly when you're teaching history? But I also think the idea of the personal as not being political is a white experience. And I think that one of the ways that you can kind of break down that false barrier and also maybe bring white students into the learning experience, let alone the experience of being raised in a really explicit or intentional, deliberate, constant way for other students in the classroom, is to reject that as a basis for learning, that objectivity. And as a historian, the way that I probably make the most progress with my students is to remind them over and over and over again that history is an objective, that I'm not objective, and it's my role or my responsibility in the course not to set the narrative for them, but that they're absolutely supposed to be evaluating, considering their politics, and considering what about the material is politically, personally, again, that divide to me is weird, important to them. And then they might also understand why for a lot of students of color, they sit in the classroom being really charged by something. It's much more loaded precisely because of how political it is, as opposed to being just frivolous. And I also think that there is a sense of making something personal as making it less serious or academic. And I think a lot of times that's why women's studies, women and gender studies courses or Africana studies courses become labeled as therapy courses, as feeling courses versus intellectual exercises. And I think that is something that we who teach those courses have to be really diligent about breaking down and addressing those things immediately in the beginning, but also making sure that we require all of the students in the classroom to remember that these are intellectual exercises precisely because of that merging of the personal political. And as a historian, that's that's just part of the methods, that's part of the curriculum. But I really appreciate this type of assignment where, you know, it's not only requiring that students consider that binary or that division, but then it's putting them in an activity where they have to really question for themselves what that division is about, and then resist it, and probably not even resist it, finally just, you know, fall into it. Fall into it.
What would be an example of that? Give me an example of this merge of the personal and the political as one puts it forward in the class, read the students.
Well, I think that a lot of times, I'm sorry, I don't assume that's just addressed to me, but I think that a lot of times that, you know, students will bring in their anecdotes, and a lot of times I'll have white students talk about how they feel that students of color are leaning on their personal experiences in the classroom as evidence of whatever it is that we're talking about. And at the same time that I will tell my students that it's a history course and that we need to use historical methods, I don't reject evidence, experience as evidence. That happened to me a lot as a graduate student, where people would tell me I was taking something personally or being too emotional.
Okay. Oh, I see.
Yeah, you know, versus
you're talking about your over-identification with the problem because of the site at which you sit and see the problem.
Well, I think it depends. I think that it's actually I think that different educators and certainly different students would think of that differently. I think that personal versus political thing is an abstract thing, and is often used to make it such that marginalized communities can't or won't bring in their experiences or their theory, right, to address the topics at hand.
I think also like one tiny but concrete example of that is that before heading to college, most students are taught to not use the word I in any of the papers that they write. And so from like the very instance of sitting down to write something, they know that they're not allowed to be a participant in that material.
Absolutely. And that's a constant question. Can I use I? It's like, who's writing it? Of course you can use I. Absolutely.
I'll jump in. I really appreciate this assignment, Professor Owens, and I agree with all the points that Professor Greer has made. I strongly believe that objectivity in scholarship is a myth, right? It's completely impossible to detach yourself from your work, because everything that we think, all of the decisions we make are informed by our experiences. And as a historian as well, like I think about the politics of the archive. You and I could be looking through the same box of historical documents, but select different documents as evidence for our scholarship. Or we could interpret the same documents in very different ways because of, you know, our perspectives on things. And yeah, in terms of like the value of merging the personal and political, I think it can allow for a more nuanced understanding of whatever the topic you're studying. It reminds us that injustice is a real issue that impacts real people. And I think that it's definitely possible, as Professor Gray was saying, to merge the personal and the political with intellectual rigor, right? It's not a zero-sum game. You can do both, and you know, you can still make clear and compelling arguments backed with a lot of evidence on issues that are still near and dear to your heart.
And I'll just, because I can't help myself, again, that personal versus political is a perspective, I think, or a foundation for a class of people for whom their personhood being political is not their experience. It's invisible, it's the norm. And so I think that's not, I think that's a fundamentally significant factor in the classroom. If a light isn't shown onto it, I think it does a lot of work. And I think a lot of that work is not good in terms of alienating or leaving a lot of people out of that learning experience. Yeah. And again, their theories and their intellect.
I would agree. And I would say that it's used mainly as a weapon against people of color who want to investigate their own histories and cultures, right? Because I personally have never heard any European scholar accused of being biased for studying European history, right? And it's also used as an excuse to hire white people over people of color in like ethnic studies, for example, in Black studies, because they're seen as more objective and therefore more qualified for the job. So we have to be attuned to how it is being weaponized and who it is used to support and who is used against.
I think it's beautiful that you're teaching this course. Just to start off with, I would have loved to have taken a course like that, especially also because before entering any university, it was always, you can't write in first person. And I think when talking, I'm kind of veering off here, but I'm talking about abolition especially, we can't not make it personal. Like my Blackness is political and it is my very, very personal experience also. And I think you said love and commitment, and I was like, yes, we can't talk about abolition and not talk about love and commitment, and also including the personal. So reminding people that this is about you, even though this might not be your experience, this is about, or not your direct experience. And I don't know, I just think it's really amazing that you taught that course, and your teaching, I'm assuming, continue to do so.
So in celebrating our Black educators, it's wonderful that we have locally in Wellesley and across the nation such powerful teachers of color. Unfortunately, in Wellesley, in such institutions as Wellesley High School, our leaders and educators of color are few and far between. And as a result, the service work, I put that in quotes, service work of educating others and combating racism often falls to them. And they are often burdened with that volunteer work, while their white peers have the opportunity to go out, give talks, and seek opportunities that merit raises and promotions. So what policy or other institutional changes do you foresee as having the potential to take the burden off our educators and leaders of color? And how do we train our white teachers and administrators to share this responsibility? And as a result, hopefully we would make this town more, and other towns in a similar situation, more attractive to educators of color. What other changes are relevant?
Well, I want to say, just because I hope that there are residents of Wellesley tuning in, I said that I'm no longer a resident of Wellesley. My husband and I were desperate, despite finances, to move out of Wellesley before our daughter was of school age, precisely because of the experiences that I know that several of my colleagues, their children, colleagues of color, have had. Because for me, coming to Wellesley and teaching at Wellesley and being in the Wellesley public school area, that should have been a huge perk of my job. A free education at schools that have these tremendous resources. And that's what I imagined when I came. But then after knowing several colleagues of color who had their children had bad experiences, but then also I've gone into Wellesley High School on 2 occasions as Professor Greer. And one of those occasions was the most explicitly racist experience that I've had, at least in the last 20 years, and certainly as an educator, and it's haunted me. So, it's important for the good citizens of Wellesley, if they have certain ideas about their schooling system, to know that I'm not alone in terms of like moving up a family plan so that I can provide a different educational experience for my 4-year-old who is just barged in. I'm gonna have you go back to daddy. See?
Mommy, I have something to say.
Yes, but we can't do that now. I'm gonna let somebody else talk while I deliver her back to her father, who has apparently allowed her to escape. But I do very much have structure.
I'm gonna hop in and say, I know of so I'm originally from Texas. I didn't include that in my intro, but I know of school districts in Texas specifically who, it's kind of like a merit system. Now, I'm not saying this could work specifically at Wellesley, but I think it's a really great start for folks to understand that like you are asking Black and brown educators to take on an increasingly heavy burden, especially right now, considering the movement that we are currently witnessing and the already undue burden that they're experiencing as Black and brown educators within a predominantly white system. And so the school districts, they provide like not a stipend, but if you're going to take on the burden of which is, I don't like the word burden, but if you're going to take on the responsibility of manning or leading an organization led by students, and students are now relying on you for even more resources and time or whatever it may be, you should provide money for that. I mean, like, just like pay your educators more, and especially pay your Black educators more. Like, if we're getting onto the soapbox, you just need to pay Black educators, period. But in addition to that, also recognize like the increasingly heavy burden it is to be a Black educator in Wellesley. Wellesley is so white, I don't even drive through it. Like, and no offense, it's just hard because I've also experienced overt racism in the town of Wellesley in the state of Massachusetts. And coming from Texas, it's very, very different. And yeah, just like pay your educators better. And can anybody on this panel and maybe even the students speak a little bit about like what the current politics are in Wellesley and how in which if educators do take on a burden of like doing more work, what does that look like for them?
I can talk a little bit to Wellesley High School. We had MECO, I think he's a coordinator.
Medical.
I don't know. Yeah, do you guys know what MECO is? Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, so we had a MECO coordinator. I don't know his official title. All I know is that he was always in the MECO room and that he was in charge of that room. And they put him in charge of diverse voices. Do you know what it's called, Liliana? I forget what it's called, but I took it and it was really great. And he was a phenomenal teacher, but I don't know. I think we talked about this and I think they either paid him nothing more for it or like maybe a little something very small. But I was like kind of disgusted. I was like, he was definitely my favorite part of the class. They had an English teacher working with him, but I was like, that is just insane to me. And he's like the reason a lot of me and my Black peers feel kind of empowered to start this movement, because we were always talking about the issues like in that room. And like, it's just, he took a lot upon himself just because he loved talking to us. And that was like the point when I was like, you really are doing so much for the school. And he's left now, but yeah, he just did a lot for the school and was never really, he went up for the MECO like head position and they didn't give it to him. And
See, part of the problem, I think, is that both your white administrators, both at high schools and even the college, don't understand the importance of race and the burden it places on you. They take it for granted as another correlation. But I think that both the administrators, teachers have to understand that being a Black person in a white community is a hell of a burden. Make it worse, being a Black male in a white community is a hell of a situation. And being a Black professor in a school which is mostly white is also even difficult. And there are all kinds of psychological studies that talks about the kinds of impact it has in terms of that person. So the first thing we could talk about, or we should understand, is when a Black person finds him or herself in that kind of setting, it's a tremendous burden. It leads to a lot of anxieties, a lot of problems. And so the first problem, I think, is the recognition of that problem. My young daughter went to Wellesley College some years ago, not Wellesley, we were in Winchester years and years ago. And I traveled a lot. I took my daughter all over. At that time, she was about 8. She'd been to Trinidad, she'd been to Puerto Rico, she'd been to Mexico, she'd been to London and France and so on. And one day the teacher asked the question, tell us, to the class. I mean, there was just two or three Black kids, as I can understand why Professor Gray had to get out. She was 1 or 2 or 3 Black kids in that class. And when they asked her, tell us where you've been, She said, well, I've been to London, I've been to Puerto Rico, I've been to Trinidad, I've been to France, etc. And the teacher called us after that class and said she was daydreaming. They could not conceive that a Black child would have had experiences outside the realm. Or from what I understood, many white kids had not gone out of that because it was not the nature of the job. So from the inception, they see you as fake and phony. Your experiences, even as a child, is not legitimated. And I think that's part of the problem. You said this guy, that room at Medco and so on. They do not, that burden, which is inherent and goes with you, but is unseen, is never understood by either your peers or those in charge. So it places an additional burden in just doing your work. So it seems to me one of the questions that these administrators have to understand is that not only the value, but that extra burden, psychological, etc., and otherwise, that being Black in a white space causes. And if you've been here like myself for 35 years, you begin to understand what it is. When we got here in Wellesley, as I said, about 30 years ago, once you hit in Wellesley, the cops would follow you from one part of town to the next. That's how you started. Mm-hmm. The presumption that you were illicit, you should not be here in the first place. And now that probably may have changed. I saw a lot of Black Lives Matter signs around the place, which I was really surprised to see and so on. But the sense of being not wanted, not being legitimate, either the level of just the lived experience or the intellectual experience. The other thing too, which, and I'll end, I don't want to talk too much, is that they don't think you should know anything, you should know nothing but those things which are Black. You're not an international person. You don't know anything about any other topic. All you could talk about is probably Black history or Black, but there are other things we could talk about. You know, I'm reading a book right now called Grooming and the whole role of gossip in terms of the legitimizing of people. But there are other fields. So you always sort of start, as a friend once says, with a minus. And therefore, you have to try to make it into a positive, and you're faced with all kinds of problems. So you're always burdened. You always walk with a burden. Third thing, I sometimes feel very strongly, if I were to fall along in Wellesley, that folks would pass me by. If I were to fall, I was going down the street and something happened and I had a heart attack, folks would just pass me by. You never have the sense of belongingness. You're always different. And so those are the kinds of burdens you walk with. It's almost sort of existentialist burdens that you carry with you. You can't speak about it unless somebody who understands what you're talking about. So the extra pressure, I think, psychological and otherwise, just to be a person is one of the first things that one is faced in. I think once those in charge understand that, or even your colleagues, I think you may be in a better place.
I think Professor Cudjoe, you know, obviously we work at the same institution, but I think you really speak to something more structural there. It's precisely because we do understand that burden, then we continually volunteer for the service work that administrators will say, well, you're making that choice. But I also, in those instances, I will not allow them to shift that over onto me, because that is part of why they hired me. That is part of why they hired me, is to do that work. It is the added value they get in terms of my being a U.S. historian. They are relying on me to do that work, right? And it's not just for the educators, it's also for the students. And this group right here, this initiative is a perfect example. You know, I have seen so many students of color at Wellesley be chewed up because they are doing the activist work that they think is necessary to be able to be a student at Wellesley. And the same is true of the faculty as well, faculty of color, that then their GPA plummets, right? And that reinforces narratives about intellect, you know, the intellect of people of color. Their GPA plummets, they go on leave of absences, they either never come back or they have this prolonged college experience that is, you know, it's negative for them. It leaves them with little sense of confidence. And I think that, you know, speaking structurally across higher education, at least, well, not just higher education, high school as well, you should get credit. If you don't get paid, I don't even care about pay as much as I want credit. I want a course release. I want more credit towards tenure. Students should get college. They should get college credit. They should get course credit for the activist work that their institutions are relying on them to do. Whatever they say, they're relying on them to do it. Start that working group over there. Yes, investigate that. Bring that back to us. That is, you know, the performa kind of approach to these issues. So you should get credit. With Wellesley in particular, Wellesley High School, Wellesley College, I'm really struck. I don't even quite understand yet, having been here since 2011, I don't understand the relationship between the college and the town very well. And I think there's a lot of missed opportunity there in terms of some structural changes for how to affect the public school system, but also larger community initiatives. It saddens me to hear you say, Professor Cudjoe, that you think that someone would step over you. It doesn't surprise me necessarily, but it saddens me. One of the things that we would joke about in faculty housing, that despite being, you know, I'm a Black woman with a PhD, that makes me a unicorn. But I always felt like a service worker, and not in a, you know, in the way I think that Liliana, you used it before, like a service worker in a sense of like, you know, we were in the servants' quarters, stuck away in faculty housing in Wellesley. That's an interesting, place to feel.
What I was responding to is the fact, I think the question was asked in terms of the guy who worked with Medco and the other kinds of things you're required to bear. And there's the sort of non-recognition. It's neutered. Absolutely. They don't see it as an extra burden. Right. Both on the students who feel, I mean, that we have the experience at school. People coming into school, they said, spending 4 and 5 years, but they'd not even presume that they could do the work. Right. So in other words, I was just simply speaking to the fact, the question was, how could the principals and the teachers and this, understand it? And I think if you start with the premise that I want to go back to, you know, invisible man, you're invisible and so on. But I think the recognition of the tremendous burden and its value, at least from the inception or as a primary way of looking to understand it as being valued and the kind of a burden it puts on one. I think if the people in charge understands that, of course, then they begin to take it much more seriously and now value it in the kinds of ways you're saying, in terms of either extra money or classes off and so on and so forth. But I think before we could do that, they must recognize its value. I mean, around this time, they probably do, but I think that's what I
just want to say, his name is Grant Hightower. Someone commented that. So his name is Grant Hightower. I think he was METCO coordinator for the high school in particular. He went up for the METCO director of Wellesley and they didn't give it to him. And he was not paid at all. That's what a teacher.
Yeah, well, no, that's it, because they didn't value what he was doing. In fact, sometimes they think that they are doing us a favor by having him there, even though he has to give up so much psychologically and financially to be there. So there is the non-recognition. You know, I was reading a book by Camus, and I think it's called The Rebel, and the whole role of recognition in terms of one's being, not being seen. And so he could do what he wanted. They didn't see him. They didn't see what he was doing. They didn't recognize himself in that encounter, and they never do. So I think that would lead to why he could do all that work and then don't even get it and don't even think about it.
I also think that it goes to, we were speaking a little bit before this all went live in terms of, you know, the particular moment we're in, and then what happens in terms of the momentum. Part of what this initiative is about is like not letting this moment pass, right? And so that recognition, Professor Cudjoe, in terms of like recognizing that burden, I think that a lot of white people think that they have, you know, they intellectually recognize it and they'll get the Black Lives Matter sign and they'll put it in their yard. And that's what I'm worried about. What happens after the sign? What happens after this moment? Precisely because if there isn't that, I'm not sure how you accomplish what you're talking about in terms of recognition of that burden, that experience, and recognition. The METCO program is really complicated for me. You know, it's just rife for all sorts of narratives around it about who's doing it a favor and then what the value is of having this particular group of students come into Wellesley schools, who that's serving. You know, the narratives that grow up around that in terms of what the overall purpose is. Is that about structural racism? Or is that about providing a more diverse learning experience for Wellesley, the general Wellesley student population? And that just adds to that burden, I think. So yeah, I'm just, you know, bigger pictures. I'm really curious about how to keep this momentum conversation going. And it seems to me that
but that is the challenge, isn't it?
Right, absolutely.
I mean, these initiatives are very important. I'm very sort of laid back and looking to see what's happening, because you've seen a lot of these moments in time.
Right.
And the thing is, what's going to happen? How it's going to play itself out? You know, I think that's the big open question.
Well, because it has to go beyond us, right? I mean, this is the usual cast of suspects. It would have to go beyond us in terms of, you know, that becoming something that's ordinary versus something that's, you know, spikes.
So I think this leads very well into the next question. Professor Greer was talking about just gaps that we see in our institutions between our students of color and our white students. And historically, there have been and continue to be many disparities between white students and students of color with regards to college graduation rates, pursuit of graduate education, and ultimately income. In your research or teaching experience, what are those most common systemic barriers to the success of students of color that augment rather than minimize these gaps? So evidence of those just systemic barriers.
Well, I think if we want to talk about this problem, it's important to consider that it's so one, systemic, and it starts way before students enter college, right? So a lot of our students of color, particularly Black students and Black and brown students, are coming from schools that are underfunded, segregated, and or overcrowded. So, you know, we can't just try and tackle the problem as it manifests 20 years down the line. We have to do a lot of work at the beginning stages. I think about, so I'm the only PhD candidate on the panel, so I'll just talk to the experience of why there aren't many people of color in PhD programs. And I think there are a lot of reasons. One of them is that, you know, students don't feel welcomed in academia. So they don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. Universities don't provide adequate resources to support their academic, social, and psychological well-being. And then there aren't a lot of professors that look like them, right? And this is, why would they enter a space where, you know, that is not made for them? Why would they feel comfortable doing all of the burden that we just finished talking about, taking on those extra responsibilities? And I just think it's very violent, and it impacts students' performance. And yeah, just thinking about my personal experience, I had a Black woman historian as a professor, and that changed the trajectory of my life. Like, you know, academia was like, I was vaguely familiar with it, but actually seeing her in the classroom made it all the more possible for me. And not just seeing her, but having her actively encourage me to pursue the path as a historian. So we can't take that for granted. I think changing the system will, an important part of that is definitely diversifying the faculty and pouring in
more folks in, as you said, just working with somebody. And you know, something funny, just as saying a Black professor or brown professor saying, you know, you could do it. You're smart.
Oh,
I mean, just something simple, just that sense of encouragement goes a really long way in terms of, you talk about diversification. I got to Wellesley, I think 30 years ago, that 11 professors, I think they still have the same amount today. So instead of all the talk, there's a lot of talk. That's what I'm saying. Let's see what happens with this moment, because we get all excited, but at the end of the day, and I'm just showing off a trajectory of 30 years, the place that I work, the amount of professors there are still the same or even less. And so you need more people to encourage you, to say, you're good. do your stuff, you know. And I think that is a very important aspect, that diversification, which I think is one of the keys to the success, and making it much more feel like home, and giving you direction in terms of what you want to do. You see somebody doing it, you want to emulate Professor Gray, you want to emulate, and that's, I think, a very important plus, simply that level.
I would even say it also have, oh, I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, please take the floor.
I think just a short thing, just building on that. I think as faculty of color, we know just what an incredible difference it can make to tell a student directly, you should go to grad school, or this was an excellent paper. But I think that also doesn't always translate to, I will write you a recommendation letter. Do you know that you need one? And I've never been to Wellesley High School, so I don't really know what the discourse is there, but I feel like I can say that if you're a white teacher there, you should take the extra step and tell your students of color, if you could write them a strong letter of recommendation, you should say, I would write you a strong letter of recommendation if you would like to apply somewhere, so that they know who their allies are instead of having to guess. In an environment that all of you are saying is presents so many outrageous challenges, then actually having people come forward to you and declare that they have that support for you could make a tremendous difference too, in terms of what you're talking about of minimizing the gaps.
And if I can just jump right in on that, because, and I'll be quick, because those are the things, what I notice among my students. White students, generally speaking, come to office hours, ask for letters, cultivate those relationships that will help them with jobs and opportunities afterwards. Students of color don't do that, and not necessarily because they don't know. A huge, huge problem for students of color, particularly Latinx and students of African descent, is confidence once they get to college, is that imposter syndrome. They're not going to office hours. They're not admitting that they don't know something. They're not asking for help. They don't know that they can call their class dean and get out of class or get an excuse for something. They're not doing those things. They don't know that they should recommend or write letters on behalf of faculty of color so that those go into their files and things. Those things that will support them, you know, these are things that their white peers are doing. At Wellesley College, Latinx students and brown students go down in terms of their achievement. They get to Wellesley and they go down. So this goes to the point of there's something that they're bringing and then we're not helping them with it, right? They are going down with that. So I think that, you know, we have to definitely look beforehand, but then all of these things that we do to allow them to demand things of their educators, demand things of their institution, to help them in learning things that if they didn't know it before, that's not their fault. That's why they're there, right? So I think all of those things, cultivating those letters and having white educators do that. I will, to your point, I will write that letter for you. Ask other people to write that letter look for people who will be allies for you in your career, right? Are things that I don't think that students of color, that is not what they're coming, again, generally speaking, to college with. Sorry, I cut you off.
I was gonna say the exact same thing as Professor Owen, which is having a professor or a teacher, whether it be in high school or whatever, just say like, I will do this for you without having to ask, but also in addition to meeting students where they are and like really contextualizing things. Let's talk about COVID, right? Like there are students, they're gonna be starting classes again, and there are students who don't have resources like some other wealthier, probably white students have at Wellesley. And it's like, where are you gonna meet your student? Are you gonna fail them? Are you gonna ask them to not go to work because I don't know. It's just like, where are you gonna meet your student? And you should always let them know that they have your support. They have your support. Yeah, they have your support. So whether that be a recommendation letter or if they need access to maybe a little bit of time, I'm thinking specifically of high school, and I know that we're having this conversation on all the different levels of education. But I think that's really important for white educators to keep in mind, and also to keep that in mind when supporting your Black educator friends as well, who are also teaching in the same spaces. Not so much writing a recommendation letter, but stand up and say something when you know that something is wrong and students are maybe probably being racist to their professors or to their teachers or whatever it may be. And I don't like the idea of allyship. Miriam Kaba says, we should be co-strugglers. I see you, Professor Cujo, you're tilting your head down there. And the idea of allyship is performative. And so just like co-struggle as educators in this system that is inherently white, and Wellesley, which is predominantly white, and just know that like, as a white educator, you can be of support of these students and of other educators as well.
I think it's really important you brought up COVID. Something that became really clear in doing remote teaching this last spring was the different situation for students. Some of my students did not want their peers to be looking into their home. And so I also heard from other colleagues, they'd be like, well, so-and-so doesn't even have their camera on. And the presumption was that they're, doing Facebook or something else, it's like, checking your bias in terms of what are the reasons that might be the case. Maybe they don't want you seeing in their home or hearing in their home for whatever reason, right? This has just laid open some whole new landscapes in terms of a person's educational experience. And we need to be not making assumptions, that we need to be not operating the same as we did in the classroom, right? There's a whole nother layer of biases that we need to be looking out for and digging into.
Yeah, it's like a notion of soft policing. Like we don't want to continue policing. First of all, we want to dismantle the whole system. But in addition to doing that, we don't want to do that to students. So when they do get into a university or a college or wherever it may be, they're now policing themselves so much to where they don't go to these after hours, or they don't go to their professors' offices when they really need it. I couldn't even tell you a single high school teacher I had who might be watching this later, so I do apologize, but like they weren't supportive, and they still aren't supportive probably today, because they never knew how to support their Black students. They never knew how to support their Latinx students, because they didn't recognize us as human. Like, you don't need us because you've already have your own stuff to worry about. It's like, that's why I need you more, So thank you for pointing that out.
I'm keeping an eye on the time. It really devastates me that we only have 6 minutes left. But there's a question that my co-organizers found particularly important on the topic of what teachers can be doing to support their students. Historically, a lot of the initiatives and like activist work to combat racism in Wellesley has been student-founded, student-led, such as this initiative. And what are some recommendations or ideas for how we transition the burden from youth leaders to town and school leaders? And additionally, how do we involve different members of the town, parents, students, educators across all levels of education, government members in this work?
I have two really quick thoughts about that in case I have to slip out right at 7. And so when I was thinking about this question, I was wondering if there are any leaders that the students currently trust to do this kind of work on their behalf. And like, do they have an established record of doing that? And if so, then working to get that person more resources and figure out who are the people that person trusts, and start to grow that network of people. But I also imagine, since it sounds like you're saying that it's always initiated by students, that you don't have a person like that, or since Grand Hightower left, perhaps. And so then failing that, I wonder if what's necessary is to fight for student representation with a vote at the town level or at the school level, so that you are in a position to advocate for your own needs. Because I think if you want them to take it over, and they've so far not done that, if it were me, I would not trust them to suddenly be able to do it capably right now.
This is also an area where I don't have, again, a good sense of what Wellesley College is to Wellesley, the town. And to me, this is something, because I know Wellesley College right now is in a moment of reckoning where its students are making demands of the college. And to me, that makes the college really, for lack of a better word, open or to requests upon behalf of the town and its students to spearhead some initiatives that are more communal beyond the college campus or the college community. And there is talent at the college level, not just faculty of color, but there should be some heft to be found at the college level that could be harnessed for the town's initiatives, for the students, for what the students are asking for, without the students having to do it all. Because the students will leave too. You all leave, you go on, you go to your different colleges, you live lives. You're not going to be here in the same way. So there has to be something that lives beyond you, right? And I really do think that Wellesley College, I'm sure they'll appreciate me for volunteering now, should be a really powerful machine in that, in a local initiative.
But just one more thing. I mean, when Malcolm was asked a question, or white students began to ask Malcolm X, what could they do to assist, to get involved in the struggle? He simply said, you go and speak to your own parents.
Yes.
You go and tell your own parents, because I cannot go and tell your parents, or you've got to find a way to go and tell your parents and your leaders. It is important that you be involved in this. And then you get the kind of longevity of which Professor Gray is speaking, but it's not something that one could come and impose. And he again is going to call upon you again for more work, but that's the nature of struggle. You got to, you said, what's the term? Bria, co-struggle. And that's the nature of co-struggling, that you have to impress upon them how important it is for them to value the experiences of others and to involve themselves in the struggle without somebody else imposing upon us. And since you're closer to them, they're likely to listen to you, because you know exactly what their fears and hopes and dreams are. And if you say you now understand with new eyes, somebody saying what silence is, whatever. If you understand with new eyes, then it's upon you to take it to them, to say, listen, you've got to get involved. And then the other point is that after I leave and go off to college someplace, you still are going to be here. And the people whom you live are still going to be here. So I think that's going to be a big, still, again, not to put it back again on you, but to a large degree, since you have entree to those leaders, you might be one of those to really help persuade them why they should, of course, take the initiative and, of course, change.
And I'll just chime in to just acknowledge the importance of the work that you all are doing now. And you are a part of a longer legacy of Black student or student activists in general. I think of the activism around the creation of Black studies programs and colleges and universities around the country, and making those demands, getting their voices heard, and having universities listen to them. So just acknowledge that the work you're doing is important, it matters, and it can make a difference.
And simply think John Brown. Get a copy of Du Bois's John Brown and give it to your parents and say, here somebody gave their lives and their children's life because they believe from the depths of their heart in the equality of folks. So part of the thing has to be education. That's what I'm saying. There are people who are willing in spite of it. And I give them John Brown. I love John Brown. Let them go take up Du Bois's John Brown, go get a copy, and then get Douglas's Life and Times and read about his relationship with John Brown. We got a sense of where others come in and really give their lives because they believe implicitly in the genuineness and the humanity of others.
Ms. Dennis, were you done?
Yeah, so basically just, I like this point about reading and educating yourself, but also acting on what it is you read, because reading by itself is not enough.
No, but I think the question was, I think giving someone a book is not just simply reading, it's an act of struggle. If you say, how do I influence my parents and the leaders to understand? There are many ways you could do it. It's not a unidimensional struggle, but there are different ways. I think that was one of the ways in which one could, of course, alert one to the fact that even though one seems to be other, that they could also participate. I don't think we should see struggle as being just unidimensional. You struggle in different ways.
Well, and I think going back to the beginning, this is an area where I could see some parents thinking it's generational and that's, their children's politics. But if they want to know you as a person, then they will at least dig into, if not adopt, your politics.
Mm-hmm. Snaps.
Yes, exactly. If that's all, everyone good? All right, cool. Thank you so much to all of you for your generosity with your time and wisdom. Your insight is highly valued by us and hopefully our entire community. And thank you to our audience's continued support throughout this series. So we look forward to seeing our audience at our next session on July 30th at 6 p.m. on this YouTube channel. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so
All right,
much.
thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. I think I'm gonna end the live stream there. How do I stop that? Thank you to everybody on the live stream. And please do not hesitate to email us at thewakeupwellesley@gmail.com and support us if you feel so inclined. We don't tell our speakers, but we're trying to put together some gifts to thank them so we can send them something to show our appreciation. Because as you heard, these are some of the smartest people on the planet. And for some reason, they decided to come talk to us. We wanted to show our appreciation. So, and we are very thankful to you as well for your continued support. Truly, it means more than you know. And I'm going to stop the live stream there. See you next time.